Hello friends, welcome back once again to my channel. So this is a very interesting topic for the UI5 learning series and it is called UI5 Binding Fundamentals. I must say this is one of the most important or critical chapter for the UI5 developers, so pay full attention till end. To start with, this is our application you think, where I have a model which is a container that contains my data and I'll be binding this data with my UI elements. So if you're from an above background, this model is nothing but quite equivalent to your internal table. Now, it has two ways of binding, one way and two way. It means like the data once you bind to this UI element and you are making a modification to this data from the UI side, the same will not be reflecting to our model if it is in one-way binding active. Similar way, if it's a two-way binding means if I make a change to this data from the UI side after binding from model to UI element, and then I'm making a change, my model state will be changed and it will reflecting my changed content or changed data. And now coming back to a simple and very popular pattern called the MVC pattern, where I have a model, view and controllers, as you can see. Now model is what I'm binding with this UI view elements, that is for rendering purpose to be used for, whereas my controller is just to do some processing logic to attach to my data, kind of a data messaging, and which basically reflecting my changes over model and view as a to and fro way. But our focus in this particular journey is obviously this binding part that we'll see and drill down to more in detail. Now let's understand the different model types. We have four models, as you can see: JSON, XML, resource, and OData. I have just segregated things into a section like client-side model and the server-side model. So here the JSON is a JavaScript object notation, which is predominantly we use it in most of the applications than XML models. And XML model has certain benefits over JSON as well, but XML model, it's difficult to use. The reason being it needs a separate parser to parse the content. Unlike a JSON model, because it's an object wise, we can handle the different properties, which is not possible over here. We need a separate parser to parse the content before we can start extracting the data. Side by side, it has more verbose than JSON. So it is basically JSON object, or rather JSON model is little, a bit slicker than this XML model. But XML model offers other capabilities also, like it offers more kind of a schema, it offers a platform independence kind of a things, rendering things, more securities. But still, for the work handling perspective, this XML model needs more work than JSON. So that's the reason in majority cases, the applications in UI5 applications, JSON model is used and not XML. So we'll be also following the same trend, like we'll be using JSON model in our subsequent discussion as well. Coming back to the resource model is something very specific or special type of model we'll see in our demo session. Like this is mainly for handling the language specific translations of the text content that will be managed by this resource model. Now OData model is something which is as a server side, you can as I have mentioned, that means you have to make a request to an API and you will get the data in the form of JSON or XML, whatever the way you are looking for. But this is our not a scope in our current episode. In subsequent episode, we'll discuss more in this OData side. Only thing is, like if I want to do any sorting and filtering based on their perspective, that filtration will be applied. For example, OData side, it will be applied on the server layer, whereas if I use a sort and filter on the JSON model, it will be applicable at the client layer, which is quite logical. Now, this is the most important factor, and that is the binding patterns. So there are the following four binding patterns that you need to master on. If you get more confidence on this area, your UI5 project development will be quite easier and convenient. So first thing we'll learn about a property binding, followed by element binding. Then we'll see about aggregation binding. Now aggregation has two flavors, as I mentioned, like a template binding and factory function. And the last one is an expression binding. So in this episode, we'll basically look at all those different binding patterns, of course. And you also see an one-way, two-way bindings also, how it works. I hope you'll enjoy these sessions. Stay tuned till end. And if you're coming to my channel for the first time, the request would be to subscribe my channel. And don't forget to hit the bell icon, because it will intimate you the moment I'll upload a new content for you. Start our demo, we just will start with a kind of a template, a very basic template I have created, where I have an index.html under web app folder, and this contains nothing but a simple a structure of our UI5 application, which we have seen our last episode. I'll give you the playlist of my UI5 series so that you can follow along the different episodes in sequence to understand more better in case you are very beginner to this topic. So here is the bootstrapping, and this is my resource roots, which is nothing but a data binding, and it's telling like, hey, this is the current folder will be my resource root. The current folder is nothing but my web app folder. Okay, so that's I wanted to mention. And also told my bootstrapping that when you load this application, make sure you load this index files also. This index file is nothing but the index.js, so that is the file it will be loaded. That pretty much just we have done to that. Let's quickly check our index.js file. Here I've just told instantiate an XML view, and I just have given that reference to my application, which is coming under the view application view folder. So instantiate this XML view and bind it to this content. The content is a div element which you have just seen in our index.html. So this is the content which the body it refers. So under the body, this XML view will be just embedded kind of. And here we have this hello kind of a text element that I have used, nothing there. So if I just go for a live server, so this is something on web app. If we just expand, we'll see hello is coming up. Okay, and we have not done any sort of a binding yet, and we'll now just start with a property binding. What I'll do, I'll just add up a dependency directory first. So let's put it this one. So now we have added this JSON model that we're going to create. So copy this one and put that in our callback function. So now create an instance. So I will be passing an object. I'm saying this is my property, and the value, let's say Somnath. Okay, so that is the property. Once I have this, so this will create a new JSON model, but this model needs to be available for application. So what I can do, we can bind it to like SAP UI get core and state model, and here we can put our model over here like this. So what I'm expecting now, our model will be created, which will have a property greeting, and that will be loaded to the main core function of our SAP UI5 library, and that we can access from our view now. That means if you go to view, to access the property binding, we have to ensure that we are putting a curly braces, and inside that we'll be using a path option because it is at the global level. So / and the property that we are going to bind. So this is what we need. So if I just save all and see our data, you see hello Somnath. Okay, it's automatically changing. So if we just put it like that, if I just do some other name, let's say in our put it hello world, we are using a live server. So the moment I save it, it will be reloaded and it's reflecting. Okay, so that was pretty much the first property binding. We'll look at more on the property binding in detail, but I just wanted to give you a kind of an introduction like how this property binding works. Now to check this where this model loaded, what you can do, right click inspect, and if you go to the debugger, you will see something, not debugger, better go to this called SAP UI get core, that the function dot get model. If we just run this one, you see this model gets loaded, and if I just little bit expand it, you'll see it's saying a two-way binding. As you have seen that one-way, two-way, you see this is a two-way type of binding. Default binding set to two-way, and this is the data which is holding the value. Now it's a property binding, so property of my model will be bind to the property of my UI element. So that's the reason we'll be using this property with / which is a path option, and then the property name. Now I have just added, to save some time, I just put this particular panel as an element, and under which I have just added a form, simple form here. and you can see this form contains certain labels and input field, which is the first name, last name, and also a label called enabled, and a checkbox. Enable is nothing but a label for this checkbox. So if I just save it now and go to our UI, voila, you see this kind of an form elements built, and currently it is not editable because we didn't set any editable property. So now to start with, what I want to do, I want to set up a model first. So in this index.js, so this model, we can call it as a employee. So this will become my employee model. Enable. Okay, so this is my model, and this model we need to bind it to this core data. Fine. In our view, we have to just change with a curly brace, and we have to say the value of this input value should be my path / because it's existing at the top, at the root, and the property name is first name. And similar way, it should be again curly brace, last name, and both enabled. So you can just change it something like put there. What will happen, you see this Somnath and Paul is automatically binding to the UI. So this binding is happening by the UI5 framework. I'm not doing any logic for this. So now if I by default it's not enabled, so if I click on this enable, you see its value reflecting now to the enabled property of the text element, and it's become now editable. So let's check the inspect. Little zoom, you see the same data is now having Somnath Paul, and this is the enable properties true. So the moment I'm setting it up as unchecked, it's getting changed, because now if I again type the same value, you will see it becomes now false, enable property false. So that way it is basically two-way binding. So I'm setting this value actually reflecting back to my model. Okay, and if I just edit and put a new value 1 2 3, and now again I put it back, expand, and you see now the value changed to Somnath 1 2 3. That means whatever the value I'm changing over here in the UI, the same gets reflected to my model. So that's a two-way binding. And also you can see the default binding mode is two-way. So we can change to default binding mode from our model to one way, and we'll see how it works. So now I have set this set default binding mode as one way, and if I now run this application back, we see this refreshing. Now if I make a change to this, this is no more working. So my model is not getting changed by setting up the enable property. It remains as false. So that's why our reference first and last name is also not editable. Another way is, rather I prefer always with a bind, rather a named model. So instead of just giving a model attaching to this one, we'll also give a name to the model, and I'm giving a model name as an employee. Okay, so that's the model name. I think that is the quotation it should come. So let's see, I mean, how it appears now. It is no more a link to, because we have a named model. Let's see whether this model we are able to see now in our get code. So let's delete it. So now get model is no more, not more giving any data, because we have a named model. So let's put this model name, and now you see we can get our content back. All the details are here with a named model called employee. Now the technique of binding this one, now we have to give the model name also a part of our binding. So to do that, we have to start with the model name employee, followed by this greater than sign. If I save it now, let's see if it's working or not. Voila, you see now the thing is coming up. So always preferable is to give a model name, so that way we know like how this data is coming from which model, we can easily debug and we can find the issue if it is not binding it well. So that is I prefer always with a bind model. So concept is the property name should be with the path sign. Let's also do a little bit on the enable property part. So let's save it and get back to our coding, I mean the UI. It's all linked to. So if I click on this now, enable, you see now the enter field gets editable. Just a quick check on the kind of a nested structure. So I just wanted to create simple an address property, which is having kind of a more it is in another object which contains a few more fields or properties. So if you want to go for a property binding, this scenario, this kind of a case, then what we can do, the same concept, the model name followed by the greater than sign, then the path expression or path should be given /, then the property is address, and then we can drill down to the specific property that I'm looking at. So just wanted to quickly demonstrate like how this kind of a nested kind of a structure adjacent model works. Now let's explore a little bit on the element binding, and we have done this thing home address as a property binding. If we just quickly check, just now have discussed. So this is we did kind of a path expression. So the same thing will convert it now as an element binding. So always remember, element binding is kind of a parent and child thought process. So if you think this formatted text is basically a parent element under which we have a property called HTML text, right? So that is kind of a child which is actually containing the data. So now a little bit tricks we can do. We can put up property called binding, and then we just link our model over here, so employee, and then address. So that was the property which I'm binding directly to this formatted text. Now to access this HTML, we no more need this path expression completely. Just remove enter address, or here as well for the city, and same thing we can do for this address for country. So that means now I have the enter address properties linked to my formatted text, which is a parent kind of an thoughts, and now HTML text is just grabbing the underlined property, and I don't need any more a path expression. So it's kind of called an element binding. It's all with a parent and child thought process. So let's save it, and if everything fine, if it really this concept works, I will see no change, and you see it's still working. So similar concept you can apply as an input field. So let's say I just want to add an input field, and there is a, let's say I'm adding a binding property similar like that, and here I just want to add my main model with the path expression, but the underlined value property I want to set it up directly now, something like, again I need to put this model name, make sure you do it, and now just let's say put street, which is the actual property, and this is called an element binding because this is my parent, and under the hood there is a property called value, which I'm just binding directly with the property, but it's no more a path expression needed. So let's save it, and let's see how it works. You see the same input field with a value now listing. Let's look at the aggregation binding now. For that I'll be using this list particular UI element as our parent, and which I'm going to bind to a product list. So carefully just notice this is my list element, and under which I just added one more element which is called object list item. Now this is a predefined element which has certain properties, as you can see, for this particular object list item, and certain other attributes also, and it has also certain property called object attribute, and it contains text as a property. Now obviously you can understand this is some sort of a template that I'm using over here, and template means it's predefined. So again, this is the parent and this is a child, So of course, it's a scenario where I can use element binding also. So let's look at how I want to do it. So I want to add these items as the parent level to bind the product model. So for that, I just created a folder called model, and there I just loaded a file called product.json, which a lot of different products information, and I'm just calling it out as a products. Now in my index.js, I have created a new JSON model. I'm saying like, hey, load this data from this particular file, and then I'm just setting up my gateway function with this product model with a named one as products. So this model name, I'm calling it as a products with p as small later. Fine. Now the binding concept is simple. Go to my app view. Here I want to bind. So again, I'm just binding kind of an element binding. So property is something called products. So this is my model name, and path expression, because it's an element binding, means the header should have a path expression, and the child or the below property elements, we don't need a path expression. So here we call it the name of the model is products, and the property that we want to bind to is this products. That is the property, this one. So this binding is done. So what next we want to do? The template is my child, and here the title I can again bind to any of the product property, but we need first this model name and greater than sign. Now I don't need a path expression because we have seen how the element binding works. So I can directly put any of the property of here, and let's put the product name. So if I just now go here and put it like that, my job is done. If I just save it, what will happen? Let's go there and let's reload it. Voila, you see the product list is getting filled in, but it's a predefined template, so that's why I call it as a template flavor. And it's a aggregation because lots of records comes under a list element. Fine. So let's complete this list with little more information that we have currently. So now just I have added the number property, and here is one concept that if I want to use two properties together in one under one property, I mean two model properties together under one UI element property, that we can use the part function, which is an array, and I just need to give the path name but without any path expression, because we have already added the property with a path expression at the parent level. So same concept, we can add it using a parts and path approach, and I'm just giving the type as a currency. So now if I just display it, this particular information is showing. Doesn't look much good, but that's okay. The binding concepts, it's working. Now just I have added number unit also, same thing, the same model name followed by the property currency code. If I just display it, you see now this currency USD is coming below. So now two same currency codes getting repeated, which doesn't make sense. Now one concept we need to talk about, then why do I need to, if I just remove this path, then obviously it should be only a single thing, right? So let's cut it now and save it, and let's see how it works. And you will see that its USD is coming, but unfortunately the amount is no more a 2 decimal USD. So that's the reason we need this additional property currency to ensure that it's a currency type, and UI5 framework will automatically take care of this decimal adjustment. Now to remove duplicate currency code, we can add another property called format option. Okay, I think it's format options, and we can just say simple that my show measure, and I just call it as false. So by doing so, what will happen? I'll not see any more duplicates, but now the currency is also handled. I mean decimal part is also handled, and it looks much better than earlier. Cool. So that's a very simple way of doing a aggregation binding. I have also demonstrated how the template binding works, because there's a template, predefined template object list item, and which is a predefined properties. We have also seen how to handle the currency in this particular way, the form of binding and the number unit, etc. So we have seen, but interestingly, the element binding still works in the same way for aggregation binding, because we are just adding up to the path expression at the header, and below we are just using the corresponding model property without a path expression, which is nothing but an element binding approach. Great. So let's also put this one, and then we can complete this aggregation with the template form. So we can use this maybe quantity per unit over here. We can just put products and then property. So if I just go, and we'll see something like this, which is coming as an additional property for this list item. That's all. So let's quickly check now the expression binding, and finally we'll look at something on the factorial function. Expression binding is a bit interesting. So we can put a property called number state, and now I can say that we need to evaluate the value as an expression. So we need a dollar, and the value that we'll be evaluating is something under curly brace. I will again check if this value, and this value is nothing but the value of my unit price, product unit price. So copy this one and put it over here. Simple way, model name first. So products is my model name, greater than followed by unit price. Makes sense, it works. This greater than maybe some threshold value that I want to evaluate as a value. So again I need a dollar so that I can evaluate the content of the property. But now let's add one more property over here in our employee, which is a different model than our product. Let's say it's a threshold value, and I'm calling it a value. Let's say, sorry, it's a 20. Okay, so now in this case we'll say the model name is employee in this case. Now I can get the product property name. So product property name is threshold. So copy this and put it over here. Now thing is, it will not work. Why? Because this employee is not linked to this parent. So parent, we have added the product model, right, but not this employee model. So that's why if I just use employee followed by the property, it will not work. The element binding will not work in this case. We have to use a property binding, and we know how to use this property binding. In some path expressions I have to give it directly. So I'm evaluating now the product unit price is greater than my threshold value. Then we'll be using an expression, means some ternary operator, and I'm saying something more than my threshold value will detect as an error, else it's a success. So that's pretty much is the expression binding. Make sure you put it an equal, because I'm evaluating it as an expression. Any property I want to get the value, I need to use a dollar. And if it is not an element binding, then we have to make sure we are using a property binding by the path expression. So let's save it and see how it works. Save all, because we have made multiple file changes together. So voila, you see now this color error and green success is coming with a value. If it is more than my threshold value 20, then it's an error. If it is less than 20, it's all coming as a success, which is a green. Cool. So let's move on the again one element binding, but this time what we'll do, we'll just make this list little interactive. So if I click on this list, I want to see more detail under the below list property, and there will be again using element binding. Let's see what it is as an extra to make this particular object item or list item clickable. I just added this type as active, and once user will click on this particular record, then it will hit this press button, a press action or event rather, and which will call a press function or kind of an event handler. So obviously we need to define this function somewhere. We'll check this out. At the same time, I added another panel, and here you can see all the labels and inputs that's showing. You probably will be questioning yourself like, what is this IHNN, and where I'm using this one, right? So this definitely an opportunity for us now to learn about a resource model, which we have skipped so far, right? So we have to just talk about this resource model. So with this UI changes, let's quickly see what reflects in our application. So I'm just saving it all and just go back to our application and refreshing. And you see there is something below panel created which talks about product details, but it doesn't give any of the labeling of my input field. I don't know what is which is what, right? So that is because my IHN is not yet working, and that's why this translation or labeling is not coming up, which we need to work on now. At the same time, if you see now all the list items become clickable. So if I click on that, this is now supposed to work, provided we write our code or logic for handling this action or press event that we need to also define. To start with our resource modeling, we need one more API as a dependency, and that is called SAP UI resource model. How I'm getting this one? If you just copy this one and go to somewhere, let's say SAP. If you are just check this out and just look at somewhere in SAP SDK about this resource model, and you see this is SAP UI resource model, and this is the path that I'm just linking to with a dot replaced by a forward slash. So that is the difference. So this is I've just added. So obviously as a process, I need to use this one within my callback function. And now we have to generate our resource model. Now to start with, what we need to do, we need to create a model called resource model. So for that, we can say like, I can call it as a resource model. So sorry, this is incorrect. Why it is not prompting? I don't know. I really should have given this one. And now this function, similar like JSON model, we need to pass an object, and we have to put a couple of things. First thing is a bundling, then supported locals and fallbacks, something like this. Now here data binding is my namespace, so that means it looks like within web app, because this is my web app. So within web app I need a folder with name IHN. IHN is nothing but internationalization, is a short form. And within this IHN, we need to create one more file called again IHN, but specifically we need to call it as a properties. Okay, so that's a special type of model. Cool. Now to fill this model, what we need to do, let's put this kind of a mapping where I just put the key and the corresponding value as I'm using over here in my app view. So this product ID, I can call it anything that I'm interested to display over UI. That's great. So let's keep moving on. And now the last piece is obviously just to find this resource model with a name called IHN. And now IHN will be now accessed over UI with the same pattern like IHN, then greater than, and the corresponding key value. And the key value is nothing, as we have seen from this list. So let's save it and see how it works, or actually it works or not. So let's go back. Voila, you see the same thing is coming up as we have maintained over there. So next action item would be clicking on this list item. I need to populate this one. So for that, we have seen somewhere as a controller, this concept. Model view controller. So we have our model, we have our view. From the view, once we click on that list item, it has to go through a controller where I'll handle this action or press event, and that will eventually affect or change the model content. So we need a controller now to create and bind it to the view. Let's see how to do that. To start with, I just created a controller folder under web app and created a file name called app.controller.js. Now this file, if I just click on that, It's the same format, same fashion, where I have used this controller as an API dependent, and I have defined, or rather extended, this particular controller for my view function called onPress item. Now this one I have added, as you know, in the list over here. As you can pretty well understand, this is what I'm just looking at. So if we go to this controller, what I'm doing, very simple. The moment user clicks on that, it will get me the specific item that user will select. And now I need the context of the binding that we have already done with the list item, and that's nothing but the products. The moment I get the context, and depending on the row selection, the context will change, as you can very well understand. And now I need the get path, which will give me the path details of that particular context. And then I'm just using this by ID, which is nothing but the list, which I'm just talking at as a panel, or the parent element is the panel. And under this parent, we have this particular form as a child. So I need to bind it. This one you can just very well link to kind of thoughts that I'm binding something like products with a path expression and the products. So I'll just delete it. I just wrote it for your understanding. So this is what I'm trying to do. So at the runtime, depending on user click, it is just going to do something like that. So I'll just delete this one because we don't need it, because technically we'll bind it over here as a logically. So we'll say like, hey, use this path and the model and bind it as an element binding. That's great. So as you have seen, now panel will have those kind of a binding, and now obviously we don't need any more a path expression, but the respective property that will be showing over here. So let's save all. On one more thing I forgot to tell you, this controller I need to link with my view with this metadata, that is the controller name, with my data binding controller.app. So this way it is kind of a hooking my controller with my view, kind of a bridge or connection I have made. All set. So now let's save this one, save all, and if I go there, what you'll see, this is the list of items. It's empty. Now if I click on any of this one, voila, you see the corresponding things get populated, which is similar. Like, let's think about little detailed way, growth element of my list item, and if I just put it like that, then what will happen? By default, the first item will be linked to my detail panel or detail form. So let's go there, and you see the first one is chai, and that is linked to this detail panel. So if I now change to the second one, let's say 1 instead of 0, and save it, then by default it will link to the second element. Second element is Chang, and that is be all linked to like that. So this is what is happening when I'm clicking on this specific item. So technically I'm binding that particular context, and then it is just getting linked to. Okay, that is the concept. It's working behind the scene. So it's pretty simple and handy. Like if you have a requirement where you want to set the default value, the first item of my list, then you can just bind it this way, and in a subsequent click, technically or rather programmatically, you can change the context by the user selection. So that pretty much handy in certain cases as well. Now let's talk about the factory function. This is pretty interesting and the useful as well. And the context is like, let's say in our list display, we are just so far have used the template kind of an approach. This is the template kind of a binding. And we have used different model binding like element binding, and so that we have all discussed. Now let's assume like we want to display the row depending on the content values. I mean, what exactly the content it has, accordingly want to change the UI element. So it's kind of a dynamically you want to set it up at not any specific predefined template that you are you are interested to use. So in that case, you need this factory function, because within this function you will decide what type of view, fragment or element you want to use in your aggregation binding. So here is an example, like this a panel I have used, and I'm calling it as a factory function example. And here what you can see, this is a list, and in this list this item is all last time we added as a products and the product. This is what we used, but this time we are adding up one more property and we are calling it as a factory, and we are defining a function that we need to define in our application view controller, and we set it up at two dependent kind of a section, and we are telling like, hey, these are the dependent fragments. So fragments we haven't yet covered that way. Maybe in subsequent videos we'll discuss more in detail, but you think about fragment is kind of a reusable UI component. Okay, so same component you can just plug and play in different context, or kind of a reusable component. We'll definitely discuss more in detail in the subsequent episode. So we have just created two fragments. One is the product simple and another is the product extended, and we have just created those views over here. So let's quickly check the simple one. It's a fragment. It's defined with this core fragment definition, and I have just added one standard list item. And here you see the binding is again the products and product name directly. So where I'm binding this one at the list level, at the parent level, because this fragment is coming as a under a list. So that's why it's kind of an element binding. Again, you can think of where I'm not putting any path expression, but the property I'm directly linking out of the model. Similar way as the product extended fragment, if we just go, we have just already have seen how the parts and things are that works, but the side by side, I don't think we need this press item, but that's we'll see later on. So this is something binding that we are also using over here as a object list item, which will come as a part of our fragment. And the same concept that applies we have seen last time. Cool. So now what next? Obviously we have to decide, like in certain context, which fragment or view to render, and that control mechanism will put under this particular function that we haven't yet discussed. So this one I'll just talk about by opening this app controller, and this is the particular function that will be using it by two parameters, that ID and context. It's a predefined one. You just always remember this particular factory will have this ID and context as a argument or parameters, and it's checking the property of the context. If this value is equal to 0 and it is property is discontinued, then you just clone this simple product, whatever this fragment I have, just clone this control, otherwise clone the product extended. And this particular unit stock, it's if it is less than 1, then I just need to add a new object attribute, because we have already seen object attribute which statically we defined at the last time over here. As you can recall, I guess this is what already we used last time, object attribute. The same thing, it was a statically defined under the view, XML view. In this case it's a dynamically, I'm just linking up in the controller, setting up this add attribute as a constructor, and I'm just giving some path text to that. That's overall, and dynamically it's deciding which fragment I need to link up, not statically. So that's the power of this factory function. And now if I just save all and go for a testing, you will see, let's close this also. So this part we discussed last time. Now the factory function example started, and you see this is the content, and you see this particular one added as an extra element. So it's a extended UI element, extended object object element, and these are the standard simple fragment that been used. Yeah, so that pretty much was the topic that I wanted to cover, and I hope you enjoyed this. And in the subsequent episodes, we'll discuss more on certain validations, certain constraints with the model, and of course, we'll be detailing more on the fragments and different OData kind of APIs that we are still not yet covered. Thanks for watching. We'll soon connect again. Stay tuned till then. Goodbye.